Hello and welcome back to my channel. For today's mountain video, we are going to be learning about high mountain rescue, why so many bodies are left on 8,000 meter mountains, and discussing the larger moral issues surrounding all of this. This video will be specifically discussing these issues in regards to the 8,000 meter mountains, but in the future we can get into rescue operations in other areas, as well as the training necessary to do stuff like this, like climbers voluntarily getting stuck in crevasses so that other people can practice rescue operations. Quick disclaimer, as with all my mountain videos, I will be reading off of a script so that I can get the information accurate, and this is all information that I have found and I mean no disrespect to anybody that I discuss in this video. This video is also very morbid. This one centers around death in the mountains, as well as talking about dead bodies and dead body recovery. So if that's something that's going to be upsetting to you, I implore you to instead go find a video of a baby sloth screaming. It will make your day. Now truthfully, if you missed last week's video, the first couple of minutes discussing the death zone will be helpful in giving you some background information. Essentially, the death zone is what it sounds like, the altitude at which humans start dying no matter what supplies you have. The reason that this is important is because a lot of failed or unattempted rescues fall in the death zone, and the death zone is where many of these unrecovered climbers remain. The reason that today's video in particular is so long is because we're also going to be getting into the details of probably the most famous controversy in climbing, when in 2006, David Sharp was passed by multiple groups of climbers, some estimates say up to 40 people, and left for dead near the summit of Sagarmatha. Quick reminder that I will also be using the traditional names of these mountains and will always clarify what they are commonly called. Climate change has been leading to melting ice on mountains around the world. While this is creating a host of issues, it's also brought the discussion of climbers' bodies left above the death zone to the public eye, especially in the case of Sagarmatha, which is estimated to have between 1 and 200 bodies left high on the mountain. A lot of people feel that it's unethical not to bring climbers home, but there's a much larger picture here that many aren't looking at. Firstly, when you're in these mountains, keeping yourself alive is difficult. You're climbing 8 to 16-hour days, sometimes longer in extenuating circumstances, at extremely high altitudes while carrying heavy packs. For many climbers, the packs will be between 20 and 40 pounds, while their Sherpas can be carrying packs of up to 150 pounds. This is partially because Sherpas who live at high altitudes are naturally much better equipped to climb these mountains. However, this also leads to dependency that puts them in danger, and this is the case when it comes to rescue and recovery. Most of the time when a climber needs rescue, the Sherpas are the ones doing the hard work. In addition to that, when families send a group to recover a deceased climber, it's primarily groups of Sherpas who are sent into dangerous conditions. Even though they're better equipped, it's still incredibly dangerous for them to be high in the mountains, and trying to recover a deceased climber can easily, and in many cases has, result in the death of at least one of the people who's doing the recovery. When people die above 25,000 feet, their bodies freeze very quickly. About 4 hours after death, they'll be frozen solid to the mountain. So during recovery efforts, Sherpas have to hack at the ice around the body to get the person loose. Every minute in the death zone counts, and this is incredibly stressful, time-consuming, and energy-consuming. The way that the body comes out of the ice can also sometimes endanger the recovery team. After they've successfully removed the frozen climber, who on average will weigh between 200 and 300 pounds in death, the climber is moved to a rigging that was previously set up by the Sherpas. This can be a form of makeshift sled, or more often, just fabric strategically wrapped around the body. According to Alan Arnett, who's a famous climber and writer, they have to tie the ropes onto the body and do a controlled slip onto the rigging that they've set up. Think about this. You're at some of the highest altitudes that man can climb. You're reliant on every bit of your oxygen, energy, footing, and ability to control yourself in this environment. And you have to do a controlled slip of 300 pounds of dead weight that can pull you off of the mountain. In addition to that, there have been stories of bodies being caught like sails by the incredibly high winds on the mountain, further endangering rescuers. Some of the most well-known deaths in these mountains have been from people who were literally blown off by the winds, and that's without anything additional tugging them. Helicopters cannot fly to altitude, which is why people have to be brought down by other climbers. Technically, turbine helicopters can fly up to 25,000 feet, but climbers don't just drop at the 25,000 mark, and things like the incredibly harsh winds and weather patterns on these mountains make it impossible. Depending on which mountain a rescue or recovery is happening on, as well as the season and conditions, some copters can make it up to camps 1 or 2, but that's again weather dependent. There have been a lot of cases where climbers have to get back down to advanced base camp before a helicopter can reach them. Let's take a look at some of the areas that teams would have to carry climbers through. This is what's known as the Black Diamond on Chagori, and this is House's Chimney on Chagori. This is the Khumbu Icefall on Sagarmatha, which is moving at a rate of about 3 feet per day, which means that they have to adjust the climbing route every day. You have things like crevasses that you have to cross, climb near, climb around, and try not to fall into. And all of the extra difficulties aside, just look at how completely vertical these climbs are, and imagine being responsible for carrying a very large moving weight as you're doing this. Some of the bodies on these mountains will forever be there because the climber fell into a crevasse or fell into an unreachable area that nobody can get to. There have also been cases of bodies being swept away by weather and avalanches also serve to separate and destroy bodies. Since climbing windows before the weather gets bad can be so small, sometimes a plan is made to come back to recover someone the next climbing season, but by the time they get back, that person is gone, swept away forever. In the case of Chagori, many of the bodies fall into areas that climbers can't reach and end up being destroyed on the jagged rocks below. I can't find the interview now, but if I find it again, I'll make sure to link it below. But I was recently reading about a woman who hikes through the Baltoro Glacier on a regular basis. I think that her name was Jordan. And she was telling her interviewer about how she has been watching these body parts slowly move down the glacier over the years, and as they're walking up the glacier, they're coming across femurs and fingers and other random bones. In the cases of these climbers, complete recovery will never be possible. The best that we could hope for would be to bring some of the bones back and DNA test them, and even though that would be much less costly than the up to $100,000 costs of these death zone recoveries, it would still come at a cost that a lot of people wouldn't be able to cover. The thing is, when climbers go into these mountains, they know they might not come back. They know the risks that they're taking, and they know that if something were to happen to them, trying to bring them home could result in a greater loss of life. In some cases, they even sign waivers before climbing, stating that if they were to perish, they want to be left where they are. Do not risk the lives of others, and do not put them through the undignified process of being dragged back down the mountain. In most cases, the outcry about bringing climbers back is because their loved ones want them home. In some cases, they just can't accept the loss without physical evidence, but in other cases, receiving benefits is contingent on proving that the person has passed away. But the permeating question is it okay to risk the lives of up to 10 people on these recovery teams to retrieve one person who knew what they were getting into? In addition to the horrific reality that people have died trying to recover deceased climbers, and that in and of itself is awful, it doesn't help or change the problem of leaving bodies on the mountain when you exchange one person for another. Sorry, you might hear my chickens through the rest of this video. So how do climbers honor the dead in these mountains? Some are pushed off of the side of the mountain or into crevasses. Sagarmatha famously has an area called the Rainbow Valley where lots of climbers have been pushed over the years. Some climbers specifically request this before they start their climb, and in some cases, it's the only safe way to get them off the route so they're not either obstructing other climbers or left as a marker for them. As morbid as that is, a few of the climbers on the mountains over the years, again most famously Sagarmatha, have become markers for other climbers to let them know where they're at in their climb. Frances Arsentive, who became known as Sleeping Beauty, was one of these climbers. I'll do an entire video on her in the future, but they actually attempted to recover her and were not able to do so. Eventually she was wrapped in a flag and left at her permanent grave. As for other climbers, they're covered in rocks or stones so to be safe from the prying eyes of other climbers, as well as from the dangers of the mountain. George Mallory, who was one of the first people to ever die on the mountain, was found 75 years after he was lost on the mountain and was covered in stones rather than being brought home. I'll get into stories of specific climbers who were recovered, attempted to be recovered, and more in the future, but for now, let's talk about why rescuing a living climber is so difficult, and what on earth happened to David Sharp. Rescue, especially above 25,000 feet, can be just as difficult as recovering a body. While climbers who are still alive don't have to be pried out of the ice, there are still a multitude of problems. Regardless of the reason that a climber needs to be rescued, like a fracture or a break, or something like a pulmonary or cerebral edema, they are incapacitated. In some cases, they may be able to help with some movements and shifting their weight, but it's still a huge load to bear. In addition to that, in some of these cases, the injured climber will need extra oxygen or supplies that are not readily available. This can lead to issues of climbers needing to share oxygen, which puts the other climbers on the team at risk. Injured climbers have to be brought down the mountain in a makeshift sled or gurney, and again, helicopters are not guaranteed to be able to retrieve them from the lower camps. The issue too is that in many cases, if a climber comes down with something like HAPE or HACE, it can kill them faster than a recovery effort can happen. There have been stories of climbers who simply think that they're exhausted from a climb actually having HAPE or HACE and collapsing and dying as quickly as half an hour from the time that the teammates notice something is wrong. This means that a live climber recovery can extremely quickly become a body recovery, which becomes riskier with the literal dead weight. There have also been cases where a team of climbers returns to camp after summiting, and someone will go to lay down in their tent only to be found dead very soon after due to HAPE or HACE. Death can happen so quickly and unexpectedly in the mountains, but when you can see that something is wrong, when you know that somebody needs your help or they'll die, you'd think you'd try to help them, right? David Sharp was a 34-year-old English mountaineer attempting to summit Sagarmatha in May of 2006. He had attempted and failed to summit twice before, choosing to turn back for safety. His friends and family knew him to be a smart, safe, and experienced mountaineer, but they also knew that he considered this his last chance to climb Sagarmatha and was determined not to leave defeated. He's believed to have set out on the evening of May 13th, and he was camping just below the Northeast Ridge. On the afternoon of May 14th, Bill Kraus, a guide for Himex, with his group encountered somebody at the base of the third step, which is above the Northeast Ridge, and they believe that to be David. As they descended, they saw David climbing higher on the mountain. Other climbers had also observed a climber, believed to be David, ascending late in the day. Back at base camp, his group, knowing that he had made the right choices on 2 previous summit attempts, trusted that he would turn back if there was a problem. But it was still bizarre for somebody to be trying to summit so late in the day. It's an unspoken rule that about 12 p.m. is the time that you have to turn back because it's not safe to continue attempting to summit. Around 1 a.m. on the morning of May 15th, climber Mark Inglis, who was attempting to be the first double amputee to summit Everest, along with his guide and documentary crew, reached a rocky alcove near the summit known as Green Boots Cave. Green Boots was actually a climber named Sawang Paljor, and we'll get into his story in another video. The team were prepared to see the pair of green boots sticking out of the cave, but they were shocked to also catch a glimpse of a pair of red boots. Huddled in the cave, still attached to the guide ropes, David was sitting with his arms wrapped around his knees, his oxygen mask removed, and he apparently had ice crystals that were hanging off of his eyelashes. At 27,760 feet, this meant that he was sitting high in the death zone with no supplemental oxygen for an undetermined amount of time. The crew was horrified, but claimed that after shouting at him with no response, they believed that he was in a hypothermic coma and beyond help. Knowing that they were at risk themselves the longer they stayed in the death zone, they left him and continued their climb to the summit. About 20 minutes later, a group of Turkish climbers came across David, but despite his recent unresponsiveness, this time he supposedly waved them off. They thought he was just taking a rest and following his cue, continued climbing. Around 9:30 in the morning, Maxim Chaya and his Sherpa Dorji came across David still sitting in the cave. He was unconscious, but he was apparently shivering profusely and his nose was black with frostbite. His hat and goggles had been removed, and he only had a thin pair of gloves on. Maxim radioed down to expedition leader Russell Bryce, telling him that David's legs appeared to be frozen to the knees and his arms appeared to be frozen to the elbows. Dorji was attempting to give him oxygen, but there was no response. Russell Bryce reminded Maxim that he only had about an hour and a half of oxygen left and to get moving if he wanted to survive. But for about an hour, Maxim sat on a rock below David and wept. Maxim eventually got up, said the Lord's Prayer, made the sign of the cross, and continued on his descent. At this time, the Turkish team was on their way back down from the summit, but one of their own climbers was already being rescued due to acute altitude sickness. Despite this, Elim Elif Mavis and her Sherpa Nima selflessly tried to give David one of their own oxygen bottles, but his regulator wasn't working. They tried to find an ID for him, but were unsuccessful. They radioed Advanced Base Camp to tell them what was going on and continued down. Furbatashi, the chief Sherpa for Russell Bryce's expedition, came across David around 11:45 a.m. Furba had a camera on his helmet, and David was able to speak to him. Apparently, he said, "My name is David Sharp. I'm with Asian Trekking, and I just want to sleep." This alone should have been a red flag. Sherpas administered oxygen and tried to get David to stand up, but he kept collapsing. Eventually, they shifted him into the sunlight before heading back down the mountain. Throughout this time, dozens of other climbers ascended and descended, but have conflicting stories about David or claim to have not noticed him at all. By May 16th, confusion had set in. 2 other climbers had been lost on the mountain, but the group that David had been climbing with wasn't concerned about him. They had last seen him heading for the summit and assumed that he had slept at one of the high camps, knowing what an adept climber he was. Pictures began going around, and that's when Furba confirmed that David was the man he'd seen in the cave near the summit, but it was too late. Another Sherpa had already reported that the climber in the red boots was dead. This event in particular truly raised a lot of moral questions about mountaineering, and the biggest question of all: did David Sharp have to die? Had people made attempts to bring him down the mountain in the early hours of the morning, could he have been rescued? Would more climbers have been lost in the rescue attempt? Why did nobody administer high-altitude drugs to help stimulate David's breathing and possibly reduce brain swelling? Why did nobody attempt to bring oxygen up, as has happened in previous rescues, because a couple of hours of steady oxygen may have made a difference? Climbers don't bring enough oxygen on the summit climb for others, but there's often a small surplus at camps in case of emergencies. According to some, David was just an hour's climb above the camps for strong Sherpas. One of the biggest questions that remains is why did all of the climbers who passed David have such conflicting stories on his condition and responsiveness, with many of them claiming that they never saw him at all? Is it possible that in attempting to absolve themselves of responsibility, they exaggerated his condition to make it seem like an impossible rescue? One of David's fellow climbers famously said, "It's too bad that none of the people who cared about David knew that he was in trouble." Nearly 2 weeks after David died, an Australian climber was successfully rescued from higher on the mountain. Russell Bryce, who had already been a part of or initiated 15 other rescues on Sagarmatha, insisted that he wasn't aware of David's predicament until after David was beyond rescue. Mark Inglis, the double amputee who first came across David, claims that he radioed to Russell Bryce about a stricken climber on their ascent and was told by Russell to continue to the summit. However, he admits that he was so focused on the challenges of the climb that he may be mistaken. No other climbers on Mark's team claimed this. They simply moved on after assuming that David was comatose. For whatever reason, this has never been clarified by Mark's documentary crew. Of the 40-ish other climbers who are said to have passed David on the 15th, many of them give conflicting accounts on his condition, whether or not it was radioed in, and whether or not they were instructed to continue to the summit. This has fueled the controversy greatly and left many wondering if summit-hungry climbers simply left a man to die for their own gain. This controversy became so large that Sir Edmund Hillary, one of the first men to ever summit Sagarmatha, got involved in the conversation, stating that no climber's summit is as important as human life, and he would have given up any of his own expeditions in order to attempt to save another person. Asian Trekking was brought under fire after this, but they were not guiding David on the mountain, and the criticism leveled at them has been called unfair. David had hired them for an unguided climb. That meant that he had chosen not to take Sherpa support and other things that are involved on a fully guided climb. David was responsible for himself. The company was only responsible for obtaining the permits and transportation. David chose the no service option, which meant that technically Asian Trekking's legal responsibilities ended the moment that climbers arrived at Advanced Base Camp. This has caused some to question whether unguided no-service climbs should be banned altogether. This also leads to other questions about Sherpa support. For example, if one expedition has Sherpa support and one expedition doesn't, and this one gets into trouble, if this Sherpa support goes over to this team, and then this team gets in trouble, they may not be able to be rescued because their Sherpa support that they paid for has already been exhausted. It again brings it down to the question of, is it moral or ethical to risk other climbers for decisions that you made? After everything, Maxim Chaya offered condolences to David's parents, but he also added that David seemed to have a death wish by going alone with so little oxygen and no radio, no Sherpa support, and attempting to summit so late in the day. In the end, David's mother didn't blame any of the other climbers for not being able to rescue her son. She said, "Your only responsibility is to try to save yourself, not anyone else." Nobody will ever truly know if David Sharp reached the summit, but his friends like to believe that he did. What we do know is that he died a slow, likely extremely painful death that has left many questioning why people go into these mountains in the first place, and how anyone could walk past a dying man for a personal goal. But the reality is, David's not the only person that this has happened to. There have been a number of times that a climber is recognized to be absolutely beyond help, or that a rescue effort will lead to an unreasonable danger for the rescuers and result in a potential greater loss of life, and they've been left behind to freeze to death. David's case is sadly not entirely unique, it's just the most famous. But he is the one that brought this issue into the eyes of the world at large, and he left the question that's been asked over and over and over again. What obligations do climbers have to one another when in extreme, life-threatening condition? Are healthy climbers obligated to help the stricken, or should the fallen have to suffer from the consequences of their choices rather than endangering more lives? To end this, I'm going to leave you with the words that David apparently said to his mother before he left for his fatal climb in an attempt to reassure her about his safety.
Don't worry, you are never on your own. There are other climbers everywhere.